Hello again. This is Chuck Edson with Kiva's Corner, about to become, I hope, Kiva's Circle as a private nonprofit. My imaginary friend behind me here is Kiva Sugarman, who died in 1952, but we remember his motto here in Klamath Falls, I ain't mad at nobody. And although that's a double negative and really means I'm mad at everybody, I'm a lot less mad than I used to be. So bear with me here. This is a continuation of our discussion of a book by Brian Klaas, the title Corruptible, Who Gets Power and How It Changes Us. I've kind of changed this title to How Do We Get Bad Leaders and What to Do About It. And this, like I said, this is following up on what we covered earlier. And in that book, Klaas discusses at the beginning 4 questions. One, how do the wrong people come to power? And on that question, he focuses on 2 things, mostly recruitment. And he talks about how we often in this country go about recruiting police officers and corrections officers. And the way we go about it, we inadvertently attract the people who most want to have power and control over other people. And that doesn't bring us the kinds of people we want to have control over us and to help us. The second question he addresses is, does power corrupt ordinary people? And there are other examples of this in history we may talk about, but he reviews Oregon history from 1980s when a guru set up a huge cult in up near Antelope, Oregon, with a few thousand people, and he was very sick and old, so he handed power over to his second in command, who was a young woman from Switzerland, an art student, but she got so power hungry that she set about poisoning the citizens of Antelope so they might win an election. Fortunately for her, nobody died. They lost the election, and she went to prison for 7 years. The other question is, why do we let bad leaders lead us? Briefly, it's the way we evolved. We evolved through 6 or 7 million years to deal with very threatening environments, and we wanted male, aggressive, decisive leaders to keep us in line and others in line in our group. And if we got in trouble with another tribe, we wanted to keep the barbarians outside the gate, or the lions outside the gate, whatever it was.
Who can speak to us? I can.
Anyway, I add that our 2-party system promotes direct rivalries and conflict, and I want to talk about that at the end. But Klaas advises that we should listen to the people who, if we're talking about candidates, listen to the people who know the candidate. And if there's something good, it might be worth considering, or they may be looking for a way to get their own power. But if they say something negative about a candidate, if they're lying, that candidate can sue them for slander and get a lot of money. So when it comes to that sort of situation, I say we should pay particular attention to the former associates for that candidate. He then Klaas gets into his most compelling ideas about how to hold. He has some ideas about holding government officials in check, and he uses an example of what New York police did with their police force, and that is they set up sting operations where they'd ask an officer to hold a crime scene, but it was really set up with drugs and money and guns, and if the guy tried to stash them away, he was caught for it. We ended that first episode looking at what Klaas calls the dark triad, and that is the combination of narcissism, Machiavellianism, and psychopathy. So that's where we start here today. So here, class talks about, we're looking at the dark triad where we left off. And you see on the left, narcissists, they're people who believe they're good enough and special enough that they deserve to have power, and they apply it, and they run for power and run for office. Once they get elected, if the person is also a Machiavellian, they know how to work other people to their own ends, to influence the public, to win the election. Then the psychopaths are the ones, once they get into office, they're the ones that will resort to more drastic means to keep power. That's where we ended episode 1, but we're picking up here. So there is another dark personality trait that, to my knowledge, class doesn't talk about, and that is authoritarianism. I've mentioned that a lot of social scientists and philosophers ask the question of what went wrong in World War II. How did ordinary people become so evil and do the things that they did? We've talked about that, but also we haven't mentioned some social scientists in Berkeley who got together in the mid to late 40s and started working on another personality type, the authoritarian personality, they called it. And they wrote a book called The Authoritarian Personality in 1950. And in that they did, before the Second World War in America, there were a lot of fascists who were publicly making appearances and having large audiences, publicity events, and a very famous American was part of this, Charles Lindbergh, the pilot who was famous for flying over the Atlantic Ocean in the 30s. He was a fascist. And
France has now been defeated, and despite the propaganda and confusion of recent months, it is now obvious that England is losing the war. I believe
the call is to abandon America's friend and ally.
And I have been forced to the conclusion that we cannot win this war for England, regardless of how much assistance we send.
But authoritarian personalities, these are people who are very high on extreme nationalism, my country, right or wrong, and very much support a strong central power and reject what the people consider democracy. Often a nation like in Hitler, they were angry and vengeful about what had happened to them after World War I and how the treaty there had ruined their economy and how much they had suffered. And so the F scale, these guys came up with what they called the F scale, with F standing for fascist. And the scale asks questions that measure a person's conventionalism, they call it, and that is the support for the traditional values and practices and the national pride and often a national religion. You know, and personally, I think there's nothing wrong with that, unless you think everybody should you insist everybody should believe in what you do. Fascists too, the F-scale people, they show a tendency, inclination to use violence and behavioral control and control of free speech to keep people in line. They're also prone to have a myth of a master race, like we know about Hitler's master race, and they celebrate, as the Nazis call it, blood and soil of in their nationalist propaganda.
It must therefore make its major appeal not to rational self-interest, but to emotional needs, often to the most primitive and irrational wishes and fears. If it be argued that fascist propaganda fools people into believing that their lot will be improved, then the question arises, why are they so easily fooled?
Also, these people are cynical. I am. Many people are these days. Kind of promote suspicion of what other people are up to, but I try not to be condescending about it. But that is a feature that fascists bring here too. Also, this is a little more hard to explain. A characteristic they look for on the F scale is projection. Now, projection is one of those Freudian defense mechanisms where, like if I'm real angry at that group of people over there, I'm inclined to attribute my anger to them and believe that they're worse than I am. They're even more angry than I am, and that's projection. When you have fear or anger or some other negative emotion and it's against somebody else, you just know that other person is worse in that regard than you are. So sometimes this even works in the opposite way, or probably when somebody's extreme one way, they're also capable of projecting the opposite positively and, attribute all these super positive characteristics to themselves. They are that mythical Superman, I believe. Forget how it's pronounced in German, but Klobbermost or something anyway. But, a belief that your race is the most powerful and the best, the most righteous.
Many critics have attributed the name Superman to Nietzsche's idea of the Übermensch, which the Nazis perverted into the Aryan master race. So maybe it's not a coincidence that the American superhero was invented by two Jewish high school students in 1933, the same year that the Nazi Party came to power in Germany.
And another one is a sense of righteousness that characterizes people with fascist inclination. And we talked about this some in the Hate's Moral Foundations theory about sanctity and disgust of other people and so forth. So that I've taken some time here to try to add another dimension to what I believe class is saying about when you add up narcissism, Machiavellianism, and psychopathy, you get an authoritarian person probably, and they're somebody who is capable of being a militant dictator or someone who is ready to take up arms against his own people and execute his own. So that's what I have to say that I've on class's main presentation, but I want to add some closing comments here. I've already, put a lot of light on the darkest side of human nature, and I want to try to bring in a little light of some hope and positivity, and at the end try to put the blame where I really think it belongs. And, we've looked at the dark side of humanity, what we can display. Any of us, I believe, can go where we're talking. But I think it's we can't just look at it as individuals. We are the products of the culture we choose. But I've jumped ahead. Let's get back to how bad are psychopaths. We know they can be pretty bad. They can, there's some research on this. We'll talk in a few minutes here about fMRIs, they're called, which stands for Functional Magnetic Resonance Imaging. And that is, we can put people in these big machines and scan their brains and watch their brain activity while they're shown slides of people being tortured or people loving their children, or play audios of similar, people in agony and pain or people enjoying themselves. and people being playful and serious and studious, and neurologists can see what's going on in the brain and know what emotional state the person is in, which is pretty interesting. This wasn't brought about until the 1990s and has given a lot of credibility to neurological sciences and how the brain and different circuits in our brains can operate to reflect how we think and I guess affect how we think. Drugs can change how our brains work and change our moods and emotions. So a psychopath, you show this person pictures of people suffering and or dying or worse and destruction, and they're pretty much a flat line. They don't really show much in the way of a reaction. You show it to other people, and there you go. You can see where their centers for aversion and pain and empathy are lighting up, but not for the psychopath. Also, there's been research on this, including an interesting fellow named James Fallon, but research has shown that a small percentage of kids, maybe 5% or something, are born with brain functions and brain structures that are inclined toward this psychopathy. But they also find that it only really becomes manifest if that same kid is raised in an environment of neglect or abuse or both, and then or even not normal kids, if you raise them in the most horrible conditions, they're going to become kind of psychopathic too. But if you get the two together, you get somebody who's a more serious problem. And they did a couple of interesting studies with the fMRI that I think tell us some things. They identified the true psychopaths and said, hey, when we show you these pictures, you don't really show any empathy. And maybe the guy said, well, I don't feel any. And they say, okay, well, this time we're going to show you the same pictures, and you pretend like you really care. Do your best to muster up some feelings of empathy and regret for those people. And the psychopaths can do that. Now, you can look at that as, God, they're even worse than I thought. I kind of look at it, the dark side of human personality has got some light shined on it, and there's some hope in there. It tells me that we could actually influence psychopaths if we just make them do it enough. I think they could actually learn, take longer. It'll be harder than doing it with them as kids. We're all born as psychopaths, and our parents and teachers and others make us better, make us better people, thankfully. And I mentioned this guy named James Fallon. He was an expert in criminal forensics. There would be a defendant who did some horrible things, and Dr. Fallon, he had a PhD in neuropsychology, and he would examine the slides of their brains and say, why, of course this guy was a psychopath. Look what his brain's like. And then through some strange quirk of fate, Fallon's given a whole bunch of slides to study, including some from his own family. The worst psychopath he could identify from all of these slides turns out to be his own. And the guy is rather outspoken and frank and a little bit insulting sometimes, but for the most part, he's given great contributions to science and humanity. So being brought up right can do a lot, and I believe I've seen this happen in my career, where some of the worst offenders, when they begin to understand what it's done to their victims, feel empathy and regret and really try to reform themselves. But it's a tough road because, especially with sex offenders, it's very easy to lead a human back into our natural inclinations, and we I think we need to return to a more Paleolithic lifestyle where everybody knows what everybody else is up to and we keep ourselves in line. But that's not the kind of state I want to live in. That's the kind of community I want to live with. So give that some thought. But I think another factor that speaks to this, I believe, is that you take normal people, and if you really study this down to the microsecond, you show normal people pictures of horrendous scenes, and there's the first half a second where nothing happens. A half second later, it takes those second thoughts to come in, excuse me, and the person realizes, wait a minute, this is awful. And then the emotional other part starts ramping up in their minds and in their bodies, and they realize what it is. That what happens a half second later is what does not happen in the true psychopath and criminal. So I think we could, if we focus on people, help people, we could make them better. Now, I want to end on who we blame. We've been focusing here on the individual. Let's step back and look at society. We have a lot of people who are angry at one another. The two sides are drawn. We know what they are in this country. And instead of looking at the other side and saying how nasty they are and how great we are, maybe there's something else going on. Maybe we need to take a forensic analysis and look at this like Columbo, the crime detective. Who has the motive to, who's winning in this scene where we got two sides at each other's throats? Cui bono, as they say in Latin or in law school. Who comes out ahead in this scene? Political parties. Political parties come out ahead. Big media, news outlets, social media, people selling materials that promote this side or that side and how bad these other guys are and how great we are. Those are the ones with the motive and the means and the opportunity to promote this stuff. Our two-party system is a dangerous combination for our country and have become that. Here I want to quote George Washington in his farewell address in 1796. He said something like, "Political parties are likely to become potent engines by which cunning, ambitious, and unprincipled men and women will be enabled to subvert the power of the people, and usurp for themselves the reins of government." Thank you, George Washington. So I say our political parties and others are those powerful engines, and we need to, it's time to say goodbye to them and start talking to one another. Instead of fighting one another and blaming one another and mumbling and grumbling about each other, there are ways that we can come together and discuss these matters in a fair and even friendly way. And that is the end of Kiva's message today. Don't be mad at nobody, except politicians, some of them. Thank you, and farewell. Thank you. My throat gave out in there. How bad was my voice? I can fix it. Well, yeah, so